Our vow, and I'm going to kick off with it up front. The vow of partnership that we're talking about is this. I promise to partner with God in how I live out my, and fill in the blank. Week 1, we had a little pick your status diagram that had about 20 different status options. So you might like to fill in that blank if you are single, and we spoke about the God's view of singleness in week 1. You might like to say, I promise to partner with God in how I live out my singleness. If you're currently dating, that would be your word. If you're currently married, wherever you're at, if you've been widowed or divorced, I promise to partner with God. So it's a vow of partnership actually to God, in how I engage relationally with my current stage. There's quite an interesting and slightly humorous verse in the book of Proverbs, chapter 30 and verse 19. The writer says this. He says, there are 3 things that are too amazing for me. 4 that I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a young woman, speaking in a relational or romantic context. It's like the writer saying, I don't know exactly how a snake moves across the rock, how a ship moves across the ocean, how an eagle moves and finds its way across the sky. And in all of that mystery, let me just chuck in there, how on earth is it that a young man finds his way relationally in courting, getting engaged, and getting married? Because we are so different, and it's so mysterious, if you like. It's as if you're saying, in the aspect of romance, the aspect of dating, and the aspect of marriage, I do not understand, is essentially what that verse is saying right up at the front. Not that it's totally inexplicable, but it's miraculously mysterious. Does that make sense? Some of the differences as we've gone along are things like this. A guy will jump up, and I'm again stereotyping here, but he will open his cupboard and he will say something like, I have nothing to wear. Meaning there literally are no clothes in the cupboard. He forgot to get them washed. And now he pays the consequence. He has nothing to wear. Where a lady may open the cupboard and say, I have nothing to wear in spite of many outfits staring back at her. And I heard somebody explain that one day. He said, I've got a wife and 2 teenage daughters. He says, I think I understand what they mean when they say that, the girls in my house. He says, it's when they open the cupboard and say, I have nothing to wear. They are in essence saying, there is nothing hanging here that has reached out and grabbed me and said, wear me today. In our household, there's Jax with 3 boys, myself, Levi, and Ethan, and I think she sometimes wonders, how can these guys watch 30 men on a field chasing an oval ball on a patch of green grass for 80 to 90 minutes and then be absolutely devastated at the end that it was such a tight game and we only lost by 1 point? I also have a question. And this actually goes back to when we were dating. We went and watched a movie called Castaway. And it was a very kind of simple plot. It had one actually the only actor, Tom Hanks, and he got shipwrecked on this island. And the soundtrack of that entire movie could just be the washing of waves onto the shore. Whoosh, whoosh. And it is kind of playing out as he spends these months on the island, and he finds in the parcels that are washed up with him a volleyball. And it's got Wilson written on the volleyball, the make of the volleyball. So he, with mud, paints a smile and eyes and hair onto Wilson. And Wilson becomes his friend, this volleyball. And there's a part in the movie where Tom Hanks tries to escape the island, and he builds this raft, and it takes him a long time, and he puts Wilson on the pole on his raft, and off they go, and he just gets beaten by the waves. And there's this moment in the film where Wilson gets detached and is drifting away, and Tom Hanks is hanging onto the edge of the raft and reaching out for Wilson, shouting, Wilson! 2 people are watching the same film. One of them is thinking, it's a volleyball. And I kind of got a little smile on my face at the thought of that. And I turned to Jax, and there were tears streaming down her face. And she just mouthed to me, he really loved Wilson. It sure is a mystery how somebody with such deep feeling and compassion got to marry such a hard-hearted individual and figure things out. I think if we summarize all of that, we all need supernatural help in living out the blank, whatever that is. We all need God's divine help with whatever stage or status, some joys and some pain and some awkwardness and difficulty, whatever it is, we need His help. And I'd like to say this up front, is that our view of God will determine our approach to dating and marriage. If our view of God, and this is, I guess, part of my life message. If you've been around for a while, you would have heard me at some point talk about the difference between having a high view of God and having a low view of Him. And if we've got a high view of God, that He is powerful and majestic and lofty and has created all things and is a God of love and a God of mercy and a God of kindness and a God of holiness, very importantly, then that will determine how I approach Him and how I approach dating and how I approach marriage. Equally, if our view of God is a low view, that, well, shame, He gets on by, but it's mostly thanks to our help. And He's got lots of problems to cope with in the world, but thank God that He's got some good men and women left, us included, and we're just kind of holding out for the end of the age when God will hopefully win in the end. Our view of each other as men and women, our view of dating, our view of relationships and marriage will be a low view. And in this view, when I say I promise to partner with God, the extraordinary part of that is that He allows me to. The extraordinary part of that is that He invites me in and says, I'm willing, little guy, Wimble, I'm willing to give you some of my power and some of my grace and some of my kindness and mercy and love to enable you to keep moving forward day by day. This morning, the structure of this morning's message, maybe I can give you a little roadmap, is I want to give off the back of that 3 different ideas around marriage. And then the last bit of this message, I'd like to try and apply that to dating. We haven't touched on that much in this series, but I'd like to give 7 questions that I believe you can ask if you are thinking of getting into a relationship or currently in one, but not yet married. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But right up front of these 3 points, kind of the intro points, is that marriage is designed by God to bring glory to God. Why it's such a big deal that I need to partner with Him in a relationship is because marriage was designed by Him, and its aim or end was to bring glory to Him. I don't know if you've thought about marriage like this, but listen to what it says in Ephesians 5:31 and 32. It says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, if you were here last week, you remember we read that verse, but from Genesis 2. Paul reads it as well in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5. He quotes it and he says, this is the origin of marriage. God designed it. His very next sentence, he says this is a profound mystery. I beg your pardon. But I'm talking about Christ and the church. At first read, that comes like a little bit of a curveball. It's like, well, man will leave his father and mother, I beg your pardon, be united with his wife, they'll become one flesh. Jesus, interestingly, quoted this verse as well. And his phrase straight after it was this, therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate. So there's a divine element in marriage. It's not just a man and a woman meeting together to make their vows. It says, therefore, whom God has joined together. And then Paul helicopters out in his quotation of Genesis 2, and he helicopters out, he says, but actually, marriage, it's not only speaking at that, he says, I'm actually speaking about Christ and the church. The ultimate goal of marriage, therefore, is not my happiness, or your happiness, for that matter. It's like we arrive in this life thinking and feeling and demanding from little that I need to be happy. I'm not saying marriage was designed to make you unhappy, but the ultimate goal biblically in design by God wasn't your happiness. In fact, there's going to be some difficulties along the way because part of what God wants to do through marriage is to destroy our selfishness. And destruction of selfishness doesn't always feel happy along the way. But happiness is not the ultimate goal of marriage. The ultimate goal of marriage, the institution of marriage, is to bring God glory by reflecting Christ's covenant relationship with his church. By reflecting Christ's covenant relationship with his church. So man and woman get together and they decide to marry. They marry. And that covenant of the two becoming one, Paul says actually the real reason that exists is to create a small picture of how God and his church exist in covenant relationship. John Piper puts it like this. He says, and therefore the highest meaning and the most ultimate purpose of marriage is to put the covenant relationship of Christ and his church on display. That is why marriage exists. If you are married, that is why you are married. Christ's incredible love and his kindness and his commitment towards his church, which will never die. And the church's response, imperfect though it may be, to him saying, we connected. The picture that Revelation gives us of the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, returning for his bride, the church. Paul says that actually is the highest aim and reason for marriage existing, is to display the glory of God. A tiny microcosm of Christ and the church. And there's a lot of mystery in all of that. And yet this is how the Bible speaks about relationships. I mentioned this word, covenant, and so maybe I could say it like this as a second point, is that marriage is a covenant and not a contract. Marriage is a covenant and not a contract. This word covenant is not one that we come across a whole heap just in day-to-day activities. And yet in the Bible, the idea of covenant is there from start to finish. The one kind of covenant is between people, and another divine covenant is between God and man. And there's a few different references to covenant. There are a lot of different ways of studying covenant in the Bible. But a covenant between people, going particularly into the Old Testament here, was much more than just a contract. A contract is a written piece of paper that has got what's going to go down and consequences if it doesn't happen. Some contracts have got escape clauses as well. Marriage, remember we talk about a high and lofty view of God. He designs marriage and he gives it as a gift into the world that he's created, and it was designed as covenant. Now, in covenant between people outside of marriage, in some pictures of it in the Old Testament, you would have two parties to the covenant. In Genesis 15, there was reference to a covenant actually that God was involved with, and he says this, it sounds a little bit weird at first read. He says to Abraham, go get a number of different animals and cut them exactly in half and lay down one on one side and one on the other side. This was a blood covenant. And let's say you took a sheep and you cut that animal in half and you laid one half this side and one half that side. The space between those two halves was considered sacred space, where the covenant was worked out. Often in covenant between two parties, there would also then be an exchange of items. We see this with Saul and Jonathan, where they covenant of friendship to each other. And they exchange items. So, for example, two parties covenanting or interacting might exchange cloaks and belts, which is basically saying, I promise to protect you, and you promise to protect me. We're looking out for each other. And then the third part of covenant, which often happened, is that they may make a cut on their hands and reach together the hands, joining the right hands, and blood from one would flow into the bloodstream, if you like, of the other, and vice versa, implying that we are now the same. Some of me is in you and some of you is in me. It's a very graphic, big deal picture that when something was covenanted, it wasn't just mild and minor. It wasn't just kind of incidental. It was viewed by God, but outworked here on earth with these symbols. When we come, particularly I'm speaking in a Western culture of weddings, but I'm pretty sure that a whole lot of cultures around the world have got similar things. But when Jackson and I got married, we met together, two parties. She walked down the aisle. Her family was on one side, my family was on the other. And we met together to make our vows. We then exchanged rings. Not that I fitted her ring, but we had something physical as a sign of the covenant we entered into. And then joined our right hands and made vows to each other. That moment of marriage is a deeply spiritual, and if I could use this word, a deeply sacred moment where God, friends, family, somebody, a spiritual leader, is helping celebrate this incredible moment. It's an event, but it's a covenant relationship that should go on and on and on. Children should then be born into this union. I'm speaking in a God's view of marriage, that in the circle of the covenant, fruitfulness happens and children are born. That sounds almost, if you take the Bible away, too idealistic, too sober, too lofty. And yet, because God was the designer of marriage and marriage was there to bring him glory, he sets in place this covenant of marriage. And the covenant was always meant to be till death do us part. So the thing that would break this covenant is death of one of us. I'm fully aware that there are people here who have been divorced and remarried. And this isn't a statement on any one situation in particular. So many different terrible shades of all of that. But I've had so many people who went through the pain of divorce say to me, I wouldn't wish that on anybody else. I wouldn't wish that on anybody else. I understand that there's so much pain and difficulty, and no two situations are the same. So I'm not talking so much about that as I am about the design of covenant, the way God designed it to be. I don't know what your vows were like on your wedding day, but we used some of the traditional wedding vows, and this was part of what Jackie and I covenanted to each other. If you don't mind putting those words up, I think I put them in the notes. I, Steve, take you, Jackie, to be my wife. I was crying back then as well, don't worry. Funny thing on our wedding day, I told you about the castaway story, is this amazing bride walked down the aisle, totally dry-eyed, just smiled, just enjoying the day. I, on the other hand, and it wasn't just because of what I looked like. Those of you, thank you, that have commented on my photo that I put up. As she arrived, I just dissolved in tears. I was undone, sniffing my way through the whole ceremony. And Jack's saying next to me, "What's wrong? Are you all right? Why are you crying so much?" Wilson! His roles were reversed. To be my wife, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, from this day forward, for better, we were hoping for only that. But we got quite a bit of the other, or worse. For richer, we were hoping for mostly that, or poorer, and we had some of that. In sickness, had some of that too, and in health, had some of that as well. And then I don't know that the weight of these words can fully be understood by anybody on that day. Till death do us part. This is a vow. This is a covenant before God and before His people. This isn't something light. This isn't something that just happens. It's horrendous. The low view of marriage that culture has, and some of the people that are celebrated as celebrities, so many of them, if you touch into the stories of their lives, you will see a pattern of marriage and divorce, marriage and divorce, marriage and divorce, marriage and divorce. A low view of God outworking itself into a culture where it's just how things go. Falling out of love is not reason enough to break this vow. Because marriage isn't ultimately about that. It's about bringing God glory and showing His relationship with the church. I heard someone put it like this. If your car ran out of petrol, that wouldn't be reason enough to sell the car. You'd want to go and somehow get the tanks filled. I'm urging us today. Irreconcilable differences, whatever those might be. Marriage is such a lofty, weighty matter in the eyes of God. Whatever falling out and irreconcilable differences there have been, I'm pleading with marriages that are in some kind of trouble, in the mystery and in the differences, before God. Whatever it takes, every cent, every ounce of energy, every bit of breath, every bit of professional help. There is more help available in our day than there's ever been in the world, ever been in history before. To go and find help somehow, before God and His grace and His Holy Spirit. Few people approached Jesus in Matthew 19 and said to Him, "Is it okay for us to divorce for any and every reason?" And He said, "No, it wasn't like that from the beginning." And He quoted that verse. And then the only extra comment that He made on it, He said, "Except for marital unfaithfulness," as an allowance rather than an absolute must. I know we speak in a world with lots of pain and lots of everything. But if we aren't somehow holding up a biblical view of how beautiful marriage is to God, how important it is to Him, then we have the wrong starting point. I'm not heaping condemnation on any single person. But even if you have been divorced, I guess that there's something in you that says, preach it. Hold up a high and lofty view. It follows, therefore, that the way a Christ follower approaches a relationship before marriage is really, really important if that's how majestic God plans marriage to be, His view of the vows that we make to each other. So I'd like to speak for the rest of this message about dating. We try to apply all the messages in different ways to those that are married, those that are hoping to be married one day. I want to hone in on this. I don't think I've ever preached on this in this church over the last 5 or 6 years. And there might be some people here today who are dating or plan to date, or you've got kids who are dating or planning, or some of you got grandkids that are in that phase, or great-grandchildren. I hope this will be a resource, because if the view of marriage and relationships is high, then the way that I approach it would be a little different than if my view is low. And I'd like to suggest this morning 7 possible questions to ask when dating or engaging in a relationship. Dating is about finding someone, essentially, that you're willing to spend the rest of your life with. Dating is about finding someone that you're willing to spend the rest of your life with. And so the questions around dating aren't so much, have I fallen in love or not? I'll speak a little more about that in a moment. But to answer some deeper questions, if it relates to this covenant that we may make together. First of all, dating is about finding out, what is their character really like? As I engage on this journey and start to figure out a little more about this person, if you're a guy, about this girl, or vice versa that I'm dating, what is their character really like? That would, of course, speak very clearly to the idea that it wouldn't make sense. I'm just speaking logically here. For a Christ follower who has got a passion and a commitment to Christ, to look to spend the rest of their life with someone or engage in a relationship, start dating with somebody who doesn't share those values at all. So the Bible speaks explicitly about that in the book of 2 Corinthians. But at just a logical level, if it's totally different beliefs about God, well, surely that would be incompatibility right from the start. Until that thing's figured out, well, the other things may or may not be there, but that's a really, really big deal if it was God who designed marriage, and marriage is ultimately for His glory. Linked to that, second question to ask is, what are they really like under pressure? It's human nature for all of us in any friendships, but in particular when it comes to romance, we want to put our best foot forward in the dating space. Is there anybody who chose not to do that? You went out to put your very worst foot forward. We want to put our very best behavior forward. And so when we start dating, get into the relationship starts to move from just knowing each other to getting a little more serious, one of the things that I think is good to look for is the reactions as well as the actions. Now, these might not be deal breakers, but you want to know, we want to know, what are you getting yourself into? What awaits me on the other side of the wedding altar if this relationship goes in that direction? You see, let me speak to any girls here this morning or listening to this. Almost without fail, every guy is on their best behavior while dating. Okay? And if his behavior is terrible, if soberness is a high value to you because it's a high value to God, and he gets raging drunk repeatedly, if he at any point lifts his hand to you, at any point is verbally abusive, chances are, this is not an absolute statement because God can change anything, but chances are that doesn't improve down the line. Okay? And some of that stuff might need to be fixed outside of the relationship than inside the relationship. If God's given you a great mercy gift and gift of compassion and just wanting to make it right, and you think, man, if I just hang in there long enough, I can change this guy. It's possible that you're stepping into the role that God alone can fulfill. And he might need a little bit of space to do that. Not many guys get suddenly, after they get married, made their vows, suddenly this massive change. And vice versa. Of course, it's possible that some of us that are very idealistic set a bar that is so high that not even Jesus himself might match it. I'm not speaking about that. What are they really like? What are What's the stuff that comes out under pressure? And we've all got it. And in the phase of dating, I'm asking myself, hopefully Jax, or I knew she was asking herself about me, what's in there under pressure? When it's not just light and airy, but when we're exhausted, have some miscommunication, some misunderstandings, and emotions are running high. What comes out, and can I live with that? Thirdly, I think this is a great question to ask, is what is their extended family like? What is their extended family like? When let me use us as an example, but if you're married, when the groom and the bride arrives at the altar, on the outside, you see two people-shaped humans standing there in front of you, but the invisible part of this interaction is the huge backpack that they come with all the good, the bad, and the ugly. And none of us was raised in isolation. We've all got a social system and a family system that's behind us. When Jax married me, it wasn't just this relationship. She married into my whole extended family, and vice versa. 5 months after we got married, she was there as this newly married wife, standing with me and the rest of my family at my mother's deathbed, saying goodbye. And I remember on that day, my two sisters were young. I can't remember what the transport or what the arrangements were, but she ended up taking my two younger sisters to my aunt's house and being with them for hours. In the moment after my mom's passed away. So you stand at the altar, it's better or worse, richer or poor, sickness and health, da-da-da. But there's all this extended family. Whatever comes with that comes into the mix. Now again, these aren't deal breakers. All of us have got a little bit of crazy there somewhere. But you want to be going in with your eyes open. If it's still death do us part for the rest of our lives, that we have a good look, good conversation. Let me tell you one other little story. Yeah, not about my family. Our family is very vocal. It might have come from having 5 children, mom and dad, but supper time was no shortage of volume and noise. Just most of it loving and occasionally disagreement, but it was just the volume. Naturally, we lived quite a loud family life. Jackson's family, by and large, were a little quieter. Not completely, but in their interaction. So the one night, while we're dating, she comes to visit our home, and we're playing 30 seconds. And the volume is high and the volume's loud, and suddenly the dial goes from green, everything's okay, into red, something went wrong, and there's just a big misunderstanding around something, and we sort it all out, and we carry on playing, and I look, and Jax is shaken. So I don't know if it was there afterwards, but we get to chatting. She says, was I in trouble? That felt horrendous. It was, so look, no, that was just our family doing, that's us. So she's driving away thinking, my goodness, that felt like a war zone from my world. I'm thinking, she might have overreacted a little bit. That was just kind of us doing life. That's our thing. But in the conversing and in the discussion, she's saying, okay, if I marry in here, every family holiday we have is going to be loud. Going to be lots of noise, etc., etc. And am I up for that? Every family's got a slightly different sync, slightly different rhythm, slightly different way. Where's that person coming from, and where am I coming from, that we get to know each other? Fourthly, what is their past? Not just does it feel great now. And this isn't in a condemnatory way. It's like, what did you ever do? No. It's if the two of us are going to become one, exchange rings and cloaks and belts, whatever, I'm using the metaphor there, then all that you are and all that I am, two, God joins together. If you like, He walks her down the aisle and He oversees our union. And let's be honest and at least know what we're joining together here. Let's spend the time telling the stories, not just trying to paper over little minor details. Not trying to dredge up all the dirty laundry, but that there's a good knowledge of history. To the best of our ability, not surprises that would come down the line. That we're connecting and interacting and talking. That's why communication is such a big deal. Some people are just better communicators than others. They just chat and talk and tell and talk. And if you are dating or about to get into a dating relationship, and by and large you are quieter, just naturally God-given wiring, you're just quieter. To help the person that you're dating or going to be dating, or you're engaged, to get to know you better, they can't talk for you. There's got to be a willingness saying, hey man, I'm coming to the party. Let me talk, let me tell my story. Number 5. This is a big question. Am I eager to spend the rest of my life building a relationship with this person? That's right down at the crux of what it means to have, if I could say, a Christian dating relationship. Am I eager to spend the rest of my life building a relationship with this person? I don't think there's a whole lot of people that arrive when they kind of start the relationship, take some kind of structure. I don't think there's many people that on day one know without shadow of a doubt this is the person. Might have that feeling, but until you get to know some of their history, some of their journey, some of their family, etc., you're on a journey of trying to get more certain. So in our case, we had been in church together and in youth together, and we knew each other as friends, part of a broader friendship circle, which was really helpful because of some of my bad reactions and faux pas Jax could see, but outside of relationships, you're just observing. When we get into a relationship, before we started dating, I felt I knew her relatively well, but from a distance. As we start dating, I'm thinking she is the kind of person I would like to spend the rest of my life with. But this relationship is to make as close to 100% sure that it's her as I could be. Okay? So I had, it was like this dial of certainty that I was feeling dial up. And then every now and then we'd have a big miscommunication or misunderstanding, and the dial would go down a little bit. I'm not so sure about that. And then as our dating relationship went on, I reached a point of just certainty. Not certainty that it would all work and all be, but this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. Building a relationship. Can I make a comment at that point? If you are reached that point of certainty, you're dating somebody, get married. Covenant. This is my understanding of the design of this Proverbs 30 way of a man with a woman. We get into the relationship both trying to answer this question, is this kind of person I want to spend the rest of my life building a relationship with? And if the answer is yes, and we've worked through all of the previous few things, then for goodness sake, say your vows to each other. Waitily, but before God. If you're pretty certain it isn't, for goodness sake, for the sake of God and each other, just be honest, open. So I don't think this is heading in that direction anymore. So that means we're not going to get married to each other. Although it may be very painful, let's call it off now to enable us to find somebody else that we might want to answer yes to when it comes to this question. Does that make sense? What I've observed has happened so much in our culture, through media, entertainment, perpetuates this idea is, well, it's easy to fall in love, easy to get in a relationship. And then there's this kind of perpetual gray area and nobody really knows what's happening. And we might even, a guy and girl might even move in together, etc., but there's no journey to some kind of destination of a yes or a no, and I don't think it's good for the psyche of either guy or girl. If the guy you're dating has got such big commitment issues, he doesn't even want to talk engagement, and it's been going, and you both, maybe there needs to be a little bit of space so that God can do some help on the commitment side of things. I'm not suggesting everybody goes and breaks up now. But it's like we've got to swim upstream in some of these things where culture just says, oh, that's okay, just go along year after year after year. I don't think it's okay. It's not how God designed it to be the way I understand it. Marriage is about two people getting together and saying, let's build a godly life together till death do us part. And the times when we can get that right, Mark Gungor says, it's the closest thing to heaven. And the times when it's done wrong, the closest thing to hell on earth. So we need his help. All right, two more questions. Sixthly, this is a good question, I think, is what do caring, I think they were all good, but this one I'm just throwing in there as well. What do caring, godly advisors think? Now, I heard somebody say this, it's a good idea to have some kind of veto system in your life, okay? Ultimately, that guy and that girl have got to make their own decisions before God. The difficulty in all of this space is, of course, our emotions, our feelings. Feelings should not be the final decider in answering the above 5 questions. It's quite astonishing that when it comes to most big, important things about our lives, it's like, we speak about relationships as well. I've just got to be honest. I've just got to go with my feelings. Every single other person around you just can see there is some trauma involved here. I've just got to be honest with my feelings. It's amazing how in all the other bits of our life, try that on Monday morning when you've got to go to work and you just say, I've got to be honest with my feelings. I do not feel like working today. I'm just going to stay at home until I feel like working. When our kids wake up, there's a whole lot of mornings, I don't know about your kids, a whole lot of mornings our kids wake up and say, I don't feel like going to school today. Well, we just want you to be honest with your feelings. You just stay at home until your feelings change. Our feelings are probably the most dishonest thing about us. I'm not saying there should be no feelings involved in marriage, but if all it is just how I feel and the fizz and the pop. Sometimes, not sometimes, often, usually, it's best to get a little bit of external advice from loving, godly, wise advisors, not to tell me yes or no, but just to give me a perspective. The Bible says there's wisdom in the abundance of counselors. It says before you're going off to wage war, get guidance. How much more something even more important like marriage? Hopefully they're not the same thing. Before Jax knew how I felt about her, I'm just telling it as part of the story, not as it was all perfect, etc. But before I ever told her, this is how I'm feeling, I had a pretty good idea that she felt tenderly, fondly towards me. Which, as some of you have pointed out, is miraculous. I had one guy say to me, it might be here this morning as well, but saying after he saw that photo of us on our wedding day, he thought, Steve, you must be one of the best salesmen in the world. How's the Wilson? Thank you, Jax. I think before she knew how I felt, before we'd got way deep down into our relationship, one of my confidants was my dad, and he had known from a couple of years before how I felt towards her. I really appreciated his role that he played. He never once said a yes or no kind of answer. Always said, she's an amazing young girl. I remember one day we had a family holiday, and I was along with the rest of my family, and I was chatting with my dad. He just put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, thank you for sharing. I will be praying for you. That was such a meaningful thing. Not to get into just I'll be praying for you that you make a wise decision. May God guide you. As I felt this might be the right thing, and timing was a big deal as well, I chatted to my brothers. Just mentioned it to them. said, you guys got any thoughts? And then before Jax and I had this conversation together where I kind of unburdened myself of all of these feelings that I'd held, and just we had our, I would call it a first deep, honest, emotional conversation in a while. I went to see her father, and he fortunately worked close to where we were. So I just phoned him up, said, is there any chance I could pop in and see you at work? And the only mode of transport I had or could afford at that time was a little motorbike. And it wasn't a glorious bike at all. So I cruised in there putt-putting and went in to see him and sat in his office and just said, I'm wanting to date Jax. That's what I'm thinking of doing. And I just wanted to check that that was okay with you. Not that he in any way had made me feel like I'd need his blessing for that. But I thought, well, if I'm going to get married one day, I'm going to be having this conversation. If he's really uncertain about me, let's have it out now, earlier on. And so his question to me was, how do you know she likes you? Even though she had been telling him, as I found out in retrospect, but he was just probing. And then as we walked outside, he said, there's no problem. Thank you for coming to chat. Just one small request I have is please don't take my daughter on the back of this motorbike. The reason I'm saying this is not because other people should have a yes or no, but if there is wisdom, let's find out what are people that are close to me and know me well or know them well, what are they thinking while I'm going through the relationship, that there's some freedom to talk. If you are asked those kinds of questions, be circumspect. Gee, that is the most useless guy I've ever seen in my whole entire life. I don't understand how you started dating. You might well be at their wedding in a couple of months' time. And so let's just be circumspect. But if there are warning signs, let's talk. We have these flags and concerns. And if you're the person asking, get all defensive about it, well, as a Christian community with friends, people around us, hopefully they're those that know us well and can see us and help us, and at very least just say, I'll be praying for you. This, I think, is helpful when it comes to dating. And the seventh question, why is it worth waiting for marriage before getting physical? Is a question, as a dating couple, you need to keep asking yourselves. Heavy petting, sex before marriage, I spoke a little bit about that last week. But I'd like to view it through this lens of the vow of marriage and God's high view of it. Obviously, in His Word, sex outside of marriage is wrong. He says that's just an easy thing to obey. But if you were to use another lens, in line with what I've said this morning, if this person is the one I'm going to marry, spend the rest of my life with, then we've got the rest of our lives together. Plenty of time for everything. If, conversely, we reach a point in our relationship where this is not the person I'm going to spend the rest of my life with, surely, if that person is going to get married to somebody else, I have then been sleeping with or engaged in intimate marriage-type sexual activity with another person's future husband or wife, another future spouse. And I haven't met a single person who wished they haven't met their spouse yet. I haven't met a single person who wished that person that they were going to marry one day was sleeping around with as many people as possible. It's just awkward, messy space. Even if you exclude God's command, if you just think of it in a non-hormonal driven, this is worth being careful about. Some interesting research, I don't have the exact statistics, but Mark Gungor in a clip I was watching spoke about the biggest indicator of couples getting divorced in the future had nothing to do with finances, in-laws, etc., etc. The number one indicator, common factor, was how many previous sexual partners each person had had. The percentage increased exponentially with every extra sexual partner. I said this last week and I'll say it again. If you are a Christian couple but living together, in other words, you're disobeying that part of God's word, there is absolutely no drive or need to reach a decision of, yes, we're going to get married. Already living, doing all of these married things together. Buying furniture, buying stuff, etc., etc. Well, if it doesn't work out, we'll break up and go on our separate ways. This for me isn't a godly pattern leading towards marriage. And as God's children, as His sons and daughters, surely we want to be asking Him, looking at Him and saying, as this perfect Heavenly Father, please help me, because I'm frail and flawed, to do and live out my relationship right.